So this is Professor John McNeill. I have this sort of a bio. So John McNeill got his MA and his PhD from Duke University. He now teaches at Georgetown, both the history department and the School of Foreign Service. He has been the head of the American Society of Environmental History and the American Historical Association, and he's currently the president of, what was it? AHA?
Not yet.
Incoming.
Okay, incoming, okay.
In January of 2019.
Oh, okay. 19.
19.
But the election was like
Election was last summer.
summer, yeah.
And there's some question of Russian meddling.
Oh, okay, so not yet the president, and we'll have to wait to see that, yeah. And the other author of the book is Peter Engelke, which I just learned is not German, but has German parents, and he's actually from Wisconsin, right? And he's currently at the Atlantic Council, which I couldn't really figure out what was. Maybe you can, I don't know.
The Atlantic Council
Yeah.
is a think tank which produces reports that very few people read, but are done to a high standard.
Okay. Yeah. So that's
Peter writes a lot of them.
yeah. So he's not in academia then. Is he
No.
teaching or no? Okay. Does he? Well, has he or is just like a non-academic?
Well, he taught in an urban planning school before he became a graduate student here.
Mm-hmm.
But he is not on the academic track.
Mm-hmm.
He can't leave Washington. His wife has a Washington job.
Okay. So, I have some questions, and then I'm sure everybody has a lot of questions, hopefully. So I'd like to start by talking about the field of environmental history, because I know that a lot of us are not very familiar with it, and this is, to some of us, has been like the first encounter with environmental history. So I think it would be helpful for Professor McNeill to sort of outline the trajectory of the field, and also talk about your father's influence in your work. Professor McNeill's father was William McNeill. Also, world history or global? Would you call it like global history or?
He would have said world
history. Yes, I was reading about him okay, and so about the trajectory of the field and your work. Where do you fit in, and the influences in general?
Okay, so I'll speak first about environmental history as a self-conscious sub-discipline within the profession of history. It dates to the late 1970s. Like a lot of sub-disciplines, it owes its existence to currents in broader society. That is, the modern surge of environmentalism seeped into academic history and gave rise to environmental history. As a self-conscious sub-discipline, it originated more in the United States than anywhere else. And within that, it originated mainly in Western history, history of the Western states. And it had and still has a strong current of Western wilderness and national parks history to it, at least as practiced in the United States. And the emphasis on parks is transnational. There's many environmental historians that work on parks and conservation in many settings around the world, from China to Russia to Brazil. There are at present roughly 3,000 people in the world who self-describe as environmental historians, about half of them in the US. The issues that they have concerned themselves with have evolved somewhat since the late 1970s. For example, they have taken on urban environmental history, questions of pollution, of so-called environmental justice in urban settings. That, I would say, is also stronger in the United States than it is in any other context, although I think that's changing fast. The parts of the world where environmental history is most active and attracts the most practitioners include India, Northern Europe, and Australia, Canada too, as well as the United States. And there are a few places where it's practiced, but not by people from the region. So Middle East environmental history is practiced mainly by people from outside the Middle East. African environmental history practiced mainly by people outside of Africa. But African environmental history has been pretty active for 30 years now. Very high quality work. And lastly, I would say that environmental history, although born out of concern about environmental issues, has, outside of India and Latin America, gotten increasingly apolitical. And the sense of commitment and motivation that attracted people to it in the 1970s and 1980s has weakened. It hasn't disappeared, but it has weakened. Although I would say in India and Latin America that is not true. People who are attracted to it are overwhelmingly attracted to it because they feel it's a way to weigh in politically on issues they care about. How's that for an introduction to environmental history?
That is very good.
Okay, so the second thing you asked me about was my dad. My father was a historian, practiced his trade at the University of Chicago for 40 years. He described himself as a historian without portfolio, or a world historian. And he wrote one book that some people regard as environmental history. He did not. That book is called Plagues and Peoples, published in the late 70s. It's an attempt at a global history of epidemic disease over the last 200,000 years. And a lot of people have read it. I happen to know what the sales figures are because my father is no longer in the land of the living and I had to deal with his affairs. So that includes dealing with publishers. 150,000 people bought that book, which is great. I don't know how many actually read it. But neither he nor I, nor most environmental historians would consider that a work of environmental history. It does have some components of ecology in it because some important epidemic diseases are, so to speak, environmental diseases that circulate not merely among human bodies, but in environments as well. But that was only incidental to his interest in disease. And you asked me, I think you asked me about his influence upon me. The older I get, the more I think I see that in a number of respects. First of all, I too occasionally practice world-scale history, which is not something that anybody's taught to do in graduate school. In fact, people are normally actively discouraged from doing that. in graduate school, and I didn't do it in graduate school, but I have done it since, and I expect that a big reason for that is my father's influence. It could also be true that my ambition to write books that ordinary people can understand also derives from him, although I write in a somewhat more demotic fashion than he did. But he held in contempt historians who wrote in codes that deliberately excluded readers. And I'm not quite as contemptuous, but I'm still firmly opposed to writing in jargon that ordinary people can't understand. And I may have acquired that from him, although I think I could more likely have acquired that from my mother, whose contempt was even greater. So that's the way I see it.
Okay. Now, yeah, so this ties in nicely with my next question, which is like something that Professor Sand had brought up before, like the challenges of making history on this global planetary scale. How do you go about finding sources? Is there like a lot of traveling involved, and do you have to go to all these places? What do you do in terms of languages if you're going to read? Like you in your book, you talk about so many different countries. I mean, I'm wondering, how do you get to read all the information in all the language? Do you stick to stuff that has been published in English? Or also, how do you make decisions in what, if you're talking about the world, the whole world, how do you make decisions in what to include and what to leave out? And this comes personally from the feeling that I'm slightly underrepresented in your book as a Latin American. And I just wish, and I just see, I understand sort of the rationale behind it, because a lot of the division in the book is like capitalism and socialism, and then, you know, the Cold War. So it's sort of, but how do you make that decision? If the whole point is to talk about the history of, on a global scale, how do you decide what's globally important enough to get to the pages of the book and what's not?
I don't think those decisions are any harder than the decisions that you face if you write about anything for which there's abundant information. Mm-hmm. I mean, there are things you can write about for which information is sparse, and you can include every single snippet of extant information, in which case problems of inclusion and exclusion don't exist. Mm-hmm. But for most historical subjects that are interesting enough to write about, you face problems of what to put in and what to leave out. Mm-hmm. And I don't think those problems are any harder for global scale history than they are for smaller scale history. It's the same intellectual exercise. And the way I think about it and talk about it with students is to think of all the things that you could possibly say as the equivalent of a big block of marble. And then you chip away at that big block of marble, leaving out everything you can afford to leave out while still conveying your message, whatever it is, and not cluttering it up with extraneous material. And if you chip away and leave only the message, ideally you have the equivalent of a statue, something that is meaningful, maybe even something that is beautiful, although that might be too much to ask. Instead of assembling all the things that you think you might wish to say, you contemplate all the things that you might wish to say, and then you chip away, discard, discard, discard. That's the way I think of it. If I'm writing a textbook, which I have just done, I would think hard about representation and inclusion, make sure there's enough about Latin America in there. But if I'm writing about a theme, I would not seriously concern myself with that. I would want to explicate the theme, and whether the examples come from Australia or from Brazil would be irrelevant to me.
Okay.
But I would be looking for examples that support the argument that I'm trying to make and that are interesting stories to tell. And that matters to me as well. There are some historians to whom it does not matter, but it does matter to me.
And sources and languages, and how long does it take to write about the whole world, or?
So, unlike the way that you are being trained and should be trained, in which you learn to handle primary sources in original languages, world history is not done that way. There's roughly 6,000 or 7,000 languages spoken on the face of the earth, and none of us is going to learn as much as 1% of those languages. And so world history is normally written from secondary sources. It can be done from lots of different languages. When I wrote Something New Under the Sun, which is an attempt at global scale history, there's probably 6 or 8, maybe 10 languages in the bibliography. And I struggled with works in languages that I don't know well, which is just about every language. But for the Great Acceleration, which to some extent was written on the back of Something New Under the Sun, I hardly read anything. Because I knew these stories pretty well. And as you'll note, there's very little in the way of documentation in this book. So the answer is these things are done differently depending on one's intended audience and one's ambitions, but it's never done on the basis of primary documents in original languages. That's a different kind of history, which I think everybody should learn to do, but it's not the way that world history is done. It would be extremely impractical to attempt to write world history or global history that way.
Yeah, that's what I thought. So one of the things that I was most struck by in the book was the emphasis on urban environment and urban landscape, because initially when you started talking about the field of environmental history, though, there's a big chunk of people who are doing like conservation, and so when I first started reading and when I first heard about environmental history, I also thought it was like the history of nature, or you know, like connections and stuff, but not. I didn't see urban landscape as like the primary place to analyze environmental, to talk about, or to produce environmental history. But since then, I've learned that it's very much connected. And so I'd like you to talk about this this idea, because is urban environmental history separate? Is it a subfield of environmental history, which is already like a subfield of history? Or how do you view these connections, like urban ideas within environmental history?
So it is something of a subspecialization within environmental history, although there are plenty of people who sometimes write about cities and sometimes write about other things. And I would say that there are comparatively few who focus only on cities, although I can think of one or two. So it's a subspecialty that people drift in and out of. It's well represented in this book for two reasons. One is that Peter Engelke came out of an urban planning background. He wrote his dissertation on urban environmental history, basically on the management of traffic and pedestrian spaces in some German cities. And also because I was under the influence of the fact that sometime around 2010, this is mentioned in the book, the 50% threshold had been surpassed. And this struck me as interesting that in some respects a new phase in human history, not merely environmental history, but human history generally, in which we are now, for the first time, primarily an urban animal. And I suspect that that has all sorts of meanings beyond environmental ones that we will come to understand in the fullness of time, but are hard to understand in the moment.
Okay. So I have one final question, which is not to do with the book or with environmental history, but I believe it is a topic that is of interest to everyone. So recently, I was at this. What was it?
It's the Grad Student Environmental History Conference.
Yes, I was at the Grad Student Environmental History Conference, and Professor McNeill was talking about the publishing market for graduate students. So, like, how do you go about choosing what journal you will send your stuff? How far should your text be like organized for you to send it out, and expectations and basic like guidelines for us who are about to start doing this and do it, because I realize that it's much more complex than I was envisioning, and I think we need all the help we can get. Yes.
So Natascha, what do you remember of what I, and also Ellen Arnold, who is the co-editor of a journal, said?
Don't use passives.
Good. Try to
I remember.
avoid the passive voice. That's good advice. Do you remember anything else that we said?
Yes. So she talked about, what was her name again?
Ellen Arnold.
Ellen Arnold is the editor for Water History. Was it Water History? Water History Journal, and so she receives a lot of papers for publication, and she says, well, more than half of them are not even history. So people just say they write about water, and they send it to a. So she says the first thing probably is for you to check if what you're writing about sort of matches the rationale of the publication that you're sending it to. Otherwise, you're just wasting everybody's time. Right?
Yeah.
That was very interesting, because I would not imagine that, people would just write like scientific papers on water and just send it to a history journal. Like they literally never even read the journal, right? Not even like one piece.
So it would appear.
Yeah.
That happens more often with environmental history journals, I think, than it does with history journals in general. But the lesson, pay very close attention to the identity of the journal, is a good lesson.
Yes. What else?
Okay, those are good things to have remembered. What else did we say? So for Ellen Arnold and her journal, it's important to be able to write so that ordinary people can understand. That's not important for all journals. Some journals are happy to have people write in an insider code, but many journals are not. And when it comes to book publishing, the same is true. Some presses and editors are happy for you to write in impenetrable jargon, and others find that offensive and would never consider a manuscript that had that characteristic. So you got to know what your target expects in that regard. The length limit has to be taken really seriously. A lot of people don't understand this because they write for other fora in which the length limit is not taken seriously, but in most journals it is. And if they say 8,000 words and you write 8,100, they'll say cut it down to 8,000. Normally, not always. And journals have other peculiarities. So if you ever look at the American Historical Review, you will see that the articles are just packed to the gills with historiographical footnotes that nobody ever reads. if you want to publish in the AHR, you got to do this. They think, for whatever reason, that that is the most helpful and appropriate format for a journal article. And if you don't do it, they won't publish your article.
So how does a journal article differ from, for example, a chapter in the book or a chapter in our dissertation? What adaptations? Suppose we want to publish a chapter of our dissertation in a journal. What kind of adaptations would have to be done?
Significant ones, because as a standalone piece, you'll need to explain all the context and argument that in a dissertation might be mainly presented in an introduction and a conclusion. And the chapters don't necessarily need that in a dissertation or in a book. But a journal article as a standalone piece needs that, at least in short form, as well as the evidence and argument that are in the dissertation chapter. So it's in some respects a harder thing to do than writing a dissertation chapter.
Mm-hmm.
But you will write seminar papers that try to do the same thing. And my advice would be to try to think of your seminar papers as journal articles. And some of them, if you're lucky, could be journal articles.
Mm-hmm.
Every year, some of our students succeed in that.
Okay. Yes. Okay. So, questions?
So I think a lot of us are not environmental historians.
As far as I know, all of you are not.
Is there, as an environmental historian, are there things that you wish historians working on political or cultural histories included in their work so that there wasn't as much of a divide, or things that we acknowledge that you would like to see?
Just leave it.
No. I have no objection to people writing history that completely ignores environmental and ecological concerns. That's fine as far as I'm concerned. Sometimes I think they've missed opportunities, choosing not to recognize that human history unfolds within a context of life and the earth. And for most historical subjects, that context actually, in my view, has some bearing, but sometimes it's the bearing is trivial. So if you're writing about the influence of Hegel upon Alexander Kojève, and you leave out everything to do with 19th and early 20th century environment, I think that's fine. But if you were writing about the wheat frontier, the late 19th century United States, and you said nothing at all about soils or drought, I would say you've missed an opportunity.
Thank you, Professor McNeill, for sharing your insights with us. I want to ask a question about the overlapping and the collaboration between scientists and the environmental historians, or overall historians. So, is there like a gap between them? Is the gap bridging now? And are they, to what extent are they collaborating and their works are overlapping nowadays?
There's a lot of collaboration. I collaborate with natural scientists all the time. There are advantages and disadvantages to this. They're not all that different from the advantages and disadvantages of other kinds of collaboration, but they're a little bit different, particularly when it comes to preparing the final product, because natural scientists have templates that they need to work to. Short articles in which you begin with research design, and then you talk about data and methods, and then you talk about results and so forth, and they have to do it that way if they want to publish in the places where they need to publish for careerist reasons and where they can reach the colleagues they want to reach. And I don't write that way, and I don't want to write that way. So there are difficulties that emerge at the stage of preparing a final product, if it's going to be a publication, which it usually is. But the actual research and development of ideas, that usually works a bit more smoothly, although there are other tensions there, because if the research is funded research, then the discipline that has done the most to secure the funding gets more say in how things are done. And I have been on the losing end of this many times, because my discipline doesn't really bring a lot of funding to the table compared to most natural science disciplines. But there's a lot of intersection and overlap between historians and natural scientists at the environmental history meetings in this country or in Europe or in Latin America. There are always people who are trained in the natural sciences who are participating in the meetings, presenting their results on their own or sometimes in interdisciplinary teams. That is normal and routine. And on balance, I think it's a great thing, very fruitful. But it does come with tensions.
I had a couple of questions. I don't. Well, we read this alongside Chakrabarti, who I don't know if you've read this specific article.
Which Chakrabarti?
Climate History for Theses.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry.
No, I knew. I'm sorry. Which piece of Chakrabarti is what I was asking?
And the impression that I was left with is that this one is still more political and treats the Anthropocene as not an inevitable occurrence, whereas the impression from your book is that maybe, I guess, that it was inevitable as a result of these human, like, basic human drives as a species, and that maybe that inevitability, those drives will also, I guess I'm trying to get at the conclusion is pretty optimistic for the book, I think. And do you think that that's because of a genuine belief that maybe the same drives that brought the species into this situation will bring it out ultimately, or was it more just an attempt to be optimistic?
I'm not sure. It probably includes at least a component of the latter. But if the book conveys the notion that the Anthropocene was an inevitability, then the book was not well written, because neither Peter nor I think that way. I don't think anything is inevitable. If we could magically rewind the tape of human history to 5,000 years ago, and then let it play again, everything would be different. So I take the view with respect to the Anthropocene that the main explanation for it is the energy system that was adopted in the 19th and 20th century. Mm-hmm. And if that energy system had not been adopted, then there'd be no Anthropocene. But it was adopted. And it's still in place. Although I think in 50 or 70 years it will be drastically revised. And that's my main source of optimism, that the energy system is going to change fundamentally, and fossil fuels will not account for 78 to 80% of energy use, but somewhere like 20 or 30%. How much of a difference that makes, we'll have to check back in the 22nd century to find out. But if there's reason for optimism, it rests primarily on that. Although there are other ways to stabilize ecosystems and climate without radically revising the energy system. and could be that one or more of those will stabilize matters. As we try to explain in the conclusion there, that doesn't mean that the Anthropocene will be over, but it will be a less perilous Anthropocene, potentially. The Anthropocene that we're creating now strikes me as perilous. Although, I gotta say, there are people in the sort of Anthropocene enthusiasm camp who see it differently. So there are arguments, which I don't think we talk about in here, about the good Anthropocene and the bad Anthropocene. And there's a minority of people who are good Anthropocenists to say, yeah, humankind fundamentally influences the governing biogeochemical cycles of the Earth, and we can do it. We know how to manage this. So let's stop doing it accidentally and clumsily and start doing it scientifically. This gives me the creeps, but there are people who are comfortable with that outlook.
I'd like to ask a follow-up question that returns to our discussion of Chakrabarty's article. And it was not just the impression of the overall tone or how you might project the future, but a sense I think we got in reading Chakrabarty that the realization that humans are now geological agents presents a fundamental dilemma for the way we do history. And that may be particularly because he's come from a different subfield, but that somehow the humanities are in a crisis. Does that agree with your sense of things too?
Not really. I didn't think very much of Chakrabarty's article when I first read it, and I first read it for a journal which declined to publish it. The reason for that is that it struck me like, and I'm going to put this in uncharitable terms, even though Chakrabarty is a really nice guy, I've known him for a long time, get along with him great, but in this piece, he sounds like a kid with a new toy. He has discovered that nature exists and might conceivably have some relevance to human history. And a lot of historians and other humans have recognized this for a long time. And if Chakrabarty had not spent his life in business school and cultural history, he would have known this already. But it has come to him in his maturity as a revelation. I was irritated when I read this because there are thousands of scholars who have been pointing this out for decades, actually centuries. And it seemed to me that Chakrabarty hadn't noticed.
How do we, because maybe this is too much like Erica's question, but I kind of appreciated the end, how it says, historians have been lost in Neverland with the cultural and the linguistic turn.
Mm-hmm.
But, yeah, I guess it just made me wonder, but how do those of us who are working on things that aren't directly, would not obviously incorporate humans as geological agents, keep out of Neverland? Or would you say we are all doomed to?
As I say, it depends what you're writing about. And there are subjects for which I think it would be forced, awkward, and ill-advised to try to include the biological and geophysical contexts of human affairs. But then there are other subjects for which you'd be ill-advised to neglect those contexts. So it all depends on what you're writing about. And Chakrabarty had always written about things that he thought didn't have anything to do with the natural world, and then he discovered that there are important things about human history that do have something to do with the natural world. And for him, this was a crisis. Not a bad crisis, because he has pivoted very deftly and writes about the Anthropocene all the time. But a crisis in the sense that he felt that and he was right about this, I think, the dominant currents within the humanities had neglected climate change in particular, and the global environmental change more generally. But I would not say that's a crisis for the humanities. I think the humanities right now are pivoting almost as deftly as Chakrabarty. So the eco-humanities are alive and well. Well, alive and reasonably well. There's a lot of gibberish that is produced under the banner of eco-humanities.
Other questions?
Do you think that the question of being apolitical essentially now, how do you see that has happened here? And do you think that needs to happen in other places to become more powerful or to have more of a voice? The movement away from being kind of politicized. I think you said in India, it's still environmental history is still very politicized.
And Latin America.
Latin America. Do you see that it should move away, that it would be very helpful for it to move away from it, that it will likely in the near future, or?
I would not expect it to change in the near future in India or Latin America, although if you'd asked me in 1985 if I expected it to change in the United States, I would have also said no, and I would have been wrong. So I could well be wrong about this. But there's a lot of social struggles in India and Latin America that have big environmental components to them, and those aren't going away anytime soon. Now, you could say that in the United States there are big social struggles connected to environmental justice in the cities of the United States, and those have not gone away, and yet environmental history has grown more professional and less political over the last 30 years in the United States. So the same thing could happen in India and Latin America, but again, I would be surprised if it did happen, and I'm certainly not going to say it should happen. And I don't want to exaggerate the extent to which it has happened in the United States. There's still plenty of people who go to the American Society of Environmental History meetings who consider themselves first and foremost committed to environmental agendas, and secondarily as scholars. But perhaps because of the strong institutional frameworks in the United States and Europe, and the temptations of academic careers, which are stronger here than they are, I think, in India and Latin America. The pull of trying to emulate the highest professional standards and earn the respect of the historical profession as a whole, and keep a job, these pulls may be stronger and help to explain the evolution that I think I see.
Yeah, but but the fact that it's still very much a form of activism in Latin America and India, doesn't that also have something to do with the fact of the inequality of the Anthropocene? And I think this is one of my main critiques of the idea of the Anthropocene, is that it's not. I think we just talked about this earlier. Okay, so you take a bird's eye view, so it's just the humankind as a whole has this impact. Whereas if you look more closely, you will see that there's more people with much higher, more peoples or more countries and much more higher impact, and the other countries have suffered more from this impact rather than participated in it, you know, in terms of like more industrialized countries and less industrialized countries, and everybody sort of shares the cost, right? And then people who are at the receiving end more than being producers of this, all of these forms of pollution, then they have more to complain about.
That's correct, and just about everybody who writes about the Anthropocene acknowledges that, including that book.
Lee, you want to ask something? Luke?
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, so kind of back to the political question. So I found like despite the fact that maybe scholars, maybe even activists in the United States are sort of now in one camp and are no longer like in their political loggerheads or whatever, there are like a small group, and this is like with Oreskes and Conway's work, there are a small group of, I guess you can call them scientists, they are technically scientists, that are like actively fighting against all this knowledge of like really influencing political debates in our country. So I'm just wondering, like, should we be optimistic that now that there is more like a scholarly consensus that they will be able to, I don't know, overwhelm or undercut these skeptics of this argument in the science part?
I'm not sure I understand the question, Luke. Oreskes is a historian. She's a...
No, right. Well, I'm saying like with their whole like basically saying that even though there's this great consensus, there's a small handful of people that have been able to block a lot of this knowledge from having like a
right.
political impact.
Right.
So, are you optimistic that hopefully in the coming years that we will be able, I guess I shouldn't say believe, I'm really an environmental historian, but I believe in science, that they'll be able to be overcome, or they'll be able to, like, this whole emergence of doubt can be beaten?
I don't know. I doubt it. I don't think this is an arena in which data and argument are particularly effective. The politicization of climate change and environmental issues in general in this country in the last 10, 20 years is, I think, sufficient that very few people will change their minds about things based on data and argument. They have too much to lose. So I mean, it's the same thing with respect to, let's say, ideas about evolution by natural selection. You can present all the data and argument you want, but the people who are opposed to that idea are not going to change their mind. They have too much to lose. Their friends will reject them. They'll be thrown out of their community, etc. It would be illogical for them to accept the logic of evolution by natural selection. And the same now has become the case with respect to climate change. However, what happens in the United States is no longer the key variable with respect to climate change. The most important opinions on this are in Beijing and not in Washington. And that's going to become more the case as time goes on than it is now. The greenhouse gas emissions in the United States have been roughly flat for 10 years. They're falling very slowly. It has almost nothing to do with policy, but it's likely to continue. And the places where emissions in the future are going to be and where policy with respect to greenhouse gases is important is mainly China. And it really doesn't matter. I mean, it matters a bit what the policy in the United States might be, but for the last 40 years, Washington has had the opportunity to address this and hasn't, and now the opportunity is passed to Beijing, and we'll see what happens there.
One last question, then we're going to wrap
I
up.
have questions about your audience. So while I was reading this, I was struck by how accessible it is. But now you just said that you don't look to convince anyone of, well, climate skeptics of basically your argument, so who are you writing for? What are you hoping to achieve if you don't think that you won't change anyone's mind?
Oh, well, in Norse mythology, there are gods who know that they're gonna lose, and yet they struggle against the forces of evil anyhow. That's approximately the way I see it. In response to Luke's question, it is the case that very few people will change their minds about big environmental questions in this country, at least in the short run. But that is not reason enough for me, or anybody, I would say, to abandon logic, evidence, and argument, even if they're only marginally effective in the political arena. And it's much more important to me to write so that ordinary people can understand that in books, journal articles, I can be a little bit less demotic.
So your target audience here would be both climate skeptics and otherwise?
Anybody who can read English.
Anybody?
When I write books, I always have my mother in mind. And my mother was an educated woman. She was not an intellectual person at all. She never voluntarily read anything more demanding than murder mysteries. But if I feel that I should write so that she could read it, understand it, and ideally enjoy it. And the last, I don't think I've ever succeeded in, but she could always understand almost everything. I mean, sometimes I would write a word like nitrogen, and she doesn't really, she's no longer alive, but she didn't really know what nitrogen was, and I didn't bother to explain what nitrogen is. But other than that, she could understand everything that I ever wrote, and that was important to me. It's still important.
Remember, write for John McNeill's mother.
For your own mother, yeah?
Absolutely.
I don't know.
I mean, there's some mothers who
Yeah.
are tremendously sophisticated and educated that can understand any kind of jargon you throw at them, but not my mother.
Yeah.